Welcome back to the Whole Bible series. This week we are in an introduction to the prophets. The prophets of the Old Testament are broken into two sections. The first section has 5 books and is called the Major Prophets. The second section has 12 books and is titled the Minor Prophets. So what is prophecy? Prophecy, an oral divine message mediated through an individual that is directed at a person or people group and intended to elicit a specific response. In the Old Testament and ancient Near East, prophecy was one among many forms of divination. Examples of prophecy contemporaneous with the Old Testament have been found from the Mesopotamian city of Mari, which dates to the 2nd millennium BC, and in the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which dates to the 7th century BC. Israel's belief in Yahweh's exclusive authority seems to have precluded the use of all but prophecy as an acceptable form of divine communication. The ESV Study Bible says this: Mesopotamian texts indicate that long before Israel entered Canaan, other countries had prophets. These texts from Israel's neighbors indicate that their prophets claimed to intercede for people to the gods, speak for the gods, criticize the people's moral and ethical deficiencies on behalf of the gods, predict future events through special knowledge given by the gods, and denounce enemy by the power of the gods. There are 2 major categories of prophecy. Here, number 1 is prediction, or the foretelling of future events. And number 2 is admonition, which can be either accusatory or exhortatory. These categories often overlap. Yahweh's accusations can be coupled with the prediction of disaster, and comfort often came in the form of prediction of divine salvation. So let's look at the difference between both near and distant future prophecy. Old Testament prophecy was generally concerned with the immediate future. That's what we're going to see the most of. Predictions were considered to be relevant for the generation at hand, like Isaiah's warnings to Israel in the years leading up to Sennacherib's campaign. Example is Isaiah 1 through 6. However, some prophetic oracles may have had implications for later future, a concept called double fulfillment. Christian interpretation often reads Isaiah 42, 1 through 4 as having an immediate fulfillment in the socio-political context of the prophet and as having a second fulfillment in the life of Jesus. So let's take that text and just look at how it is used in the Bible. So Isaiah 42, 1 through 4 is here in the box to the left. And this is what it says: Behold my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry aloud or lift up his voice or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and a faintly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice. He will not grow faint or be discouraged till he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands wait for his law. So most people take this as an immediate fulfillment, that this was fulfilled in Isaiah's time, and that Isaiah here, as prophesying through Yahweh, is speaking of himself. But let's look to the New Testament, because Jesus also speaks about the same prophecy and claims it for himself. So let's look at Matthew chapter 12. Jesus, aware of this, withdrew from there, and many followed him, and he healed them all and ordered them not to make him known. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. All right, let's go back real quick. Jesus is not claiming this for himself. This is actually Levi or Matthew who is claiming this prophecy of Jesus. Go back to verse 17. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. Behold, my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved, with whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will proclaim justice to the Gentiles. He will not quarrel or cry aloud, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not quench, until he brings justice to victory. And in his name the Gentiles will hope. So here we see that Matthew is claiming this text or the context of this prophecy for Jesus as well. And so this is what they're referring to up top when they say double fulfillment. A prophecy can have an immediate fulfillment, but also have a future fulfillment. And this is what is done here by Matthew. He actually pulls some of this text from the Septuagint and some of it from the Hebrew Bible or the Hebrew Old Testament, and kind of makes his own paraphrase of what we see here in Isaiah 42. Now let's look at the difference between classic prophecy and apocalypticism. So apocalyptic literature is a genre of biblical writing that reveals God's actions and coming judgment in symbolic language. The transition from prophecy and apocalyptic is characterized by an increased use of symbolism and an increased use of heavenly mediators explaining the vision. The latter half of the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation are representative of the apocalyptic genre. So you've heard of the apocalypse, which is the end. Then that's what apocalyptic genre is all about. It's about the prophecy of the end times. Let's look what the survey of the Old Testament says. It is difficult to define apocalyptic literature because it shares a number of features with prophetic literature. Elements that would position a section on the apocalyptic side of the continuum include rich symbolism, often mythological, visions, conversations with spiritual beings, and cosmic catastrophe leading to the establishment of the kingdom of God on earth. The use of symbols in apocalyptic literature has often caused confusion and uncertainty for interpreters. Much confusion is caused, however, by one's mistakenly treating the vision of the prophet with the message of a prophet. So in the Old Testament, we will actually encounter prophecy about or visions of the day of the Lord. These are indicators of future fulfillment in the final days, also called the apocalypse. So we're going to see these as we go through and survey the prophetic books of the Old Testament. Apocalyptic literature became a very common genre during the Second Temple period, 500 BC to 70 AD or so, as the Jews anxiously awaited for the Messiah to appear and conquer their enemies, releasing their bonds to the other nations and ending the exile. So this is an increasingly popular genre as we leave the time of the prophets in about 400 BC or so to the time that we get to Jesus's coming and the end of the Second Temple period. The writings that come out that are apocalyptic just become more and more rampant as that time period comes. And in fact, we find a lot of this in the Dead Sea Scrolls literature and material. So who were the Old Testament prophets? So as mentioned earlier, the prophetical books of the Old Testament are formed into two categories, the major prophets and the minor prophets. However, major and minor does not rank the importance of the individual prophets, but rather the length of the book themselves. So here is a table of the prophets, the major and minor prophets, in sequential order. And you'll see that obviously this doesn't line up with what we have in the Bible, but there's some information here for you to look at. about which kingdom that they prophesied to, and approximately their time frame of uh, being active in prophecy. The prophetical books are not placed, like I said, in dated order, nor are they placed in written order. Instead, they are placed in ordered by length. So Isaiah, which is the longest book, and the rest of the major prophets, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. So Lamentations is also written by Jeremiah, as you'll see in the table. Those 5 books would have each been their own separate scroll because of their length. The 12 minor prophetical books would have been kept on a single scroll due to their brevity. In fact, Isaiah is actually quite a bit longer than all 12 of the minor prophets put together. So here's the dating period of the 17 books of prophecy that we're going to look at when those prophets were active, approximately 800 to 400 BC or so. There is some prophecy spread throughout the earlier books of the Old Testament. Moses may be considered to be the first Hebrew prophet, but you guys remember we went through Elijah and Elisha and those kind of guys. Those guys were prophets. They just didn't have their own individual books placed into the Hebrew Bible. So this is the period that we're looking at for the most part is 800 to 400 BC. Why were these books written? So prophetical books were written as a record and a history of the Hebrew people and their God Yahweh. Later generations looked back to see that God used people to communicate to them and that he fulfilled the promises of both his punishments and his forgiveness. Apocalyptic prophecy helped the Jews to see that God had promised to restore them to their rightful place in relationship with him and to use them for the eventually reclaiming the nations for Yahweh. From the time of exile, as we talked about in 586 BC, the Jews began anxiously awaiting the promised Messiah, the anointed one. Only he could restore creation to its rightful place. And thus, that's why we get the increase in their anxiousness and the increase in the apocalyptic books and writings during that period. Many of those which fall outside of the canon of the Bible. Providentially, these books also allow people to look back and see how Jesus fulfilled the prophecy of the coming Messiah and put into context his true mission. When we review the New Testament later in our survey series, we will see how Jesus and the disciples used prophecy to prove Jesus as the Messiah. So, should we view prophecy as literal? So, to make a quick answer here, yes and no. This is a question that comes with a lot of variables. So, yes, we should understand prophecy or the words of God as spoken through a prophet as literal foretelling of future events. But please note that this does not apply to prophecy from false prophets. False prophecy may be initiated by other spiritual beings, like the gods of the nations, or by an individual human trying to deceive others, or in fact, could be initiated by Yahweh himself. And we see an example of that in 1 Kings 22, 21 through 22, which I have here to the left. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, I will entice him. And he's speaking about Ahab here, King Ahab of the northern kingdom. And the Lord said to him, by what means? And he said, I will go out and I will be a lying spirit in the mouths of all his prophets. And he said, you are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go out and do so. So here, God authorizes the use of false prophecy through these prophets of another nation, prophet of another God, to actually trick Ahab into putting himself into mortal danger. So yes, so prophecy should be seen as literal foretelling of future events when it is true prophecy from God? And then again, no, we shouldn't look at apocalyptic prophecy as necessarily literal. So I have here just a little blurb. Visions in apocalyptic prophecy are often surreal and symbolic in nature. The promises of God within these prophecies should be taken literally, but the circumstances and means of this may not be clearly understood due to symbology or from God hiding elements of the future from the enemy. So let's think back to Old Testament prophecy. If God had made all of the Old Testament prophecy about the Messiah very clear so that everyone could understand it, again, guess what? Satan and the enemies of God would have also known exactly what God was planning. And therefore, they wouldn't have tried to kill the Messiah, but they would have tried to stop God some other way. As we will see from our survey of the prophets, this also does not preclude God from promising disaster and then later relenting of it after the people have repented. So just because something is prophesied through a prophet does not necessarily mean that it will come to pass. Often the prophets give a warning of disaster, but then also a promise of relenting on God's part if they would repent. So I hope this is clear. If not, then feel free to ask questions later and we can deal with that as it comes. I also want to talk about prediction and fulfillment. So when we think of prophecy, we think of the prophecy being a prediction, and then we want that to be fulfilled, right? So I pulled this out of Survey of the Old Testament. I forgot to write it on here. Forgive me for that. But prediction and fulfillment are two of the terms most often connected to prophetic literature, but both can lead to harmful misperceptions about the nature of prophecy. Rather than regarding prophecy as prediction, we find it more helpful to consider consider prophecy as God's syllabus. This syllabus for a course does not predict what will happen in each class period of the term, but presents the instructor's plans and the intention for that period. The significance of the document is that the instructor is in a position to carry it out. Likewise, when a judge passes a sentence on a criminal, he is not predicting what will happen to that person. Rather, he is decreeing what ought to be done and is in a position to see that it is done. Fulfillment can also be a misleading term. Some people are inclined to neglect the message of the prophets in an often elusive search for fulfillments that inevitably leads to speculation that departs further and further from the text. It is often assumed that the prophets had specific events in mind, but that was not necessarily the case. It is not essential to be able to discern a prophet's intention in terms of fulfillment as long as the intended message is understood. The prophet was aware what the message was, yet he did not necessarily know what shape the fulfillment of the prophecy might take. It was the message that was inspired, and it was the message that was the medium of God's revelation. The fulfillment was almost incidental, though it was certainly important that it take place. Fulfillment should be seen as indicating an appropriate correlation between the prophetic word and the event to which it is related. So, when a New Testament author suggests that some event fulfilled an Old Testament passage, he is not suggesting that the Old Testament author was speaking and thinking of this event, but rather that an appropriate correlation can be drawn between the Old Testament and the event. Okay, so with that in mind, I want to go back real quick to Matthew. So here, Matthew is pulling out a blurb from Isaiah, a prophecy in which Isaiah may be discussing or talking about himself. And Matthew's using that also to describe Jesus. All right. And so we can see that there is an appropriate correlation that Matthew is drawing between the two events, and that it's not necessarily meant as a prophecy for one individual, but it may have been God may have placed it in Isaiah's mouth to both refer to himself and to Jesus later on. So I hope that gives you a few things to think about. Prophecy is not an easy topic. It's not something that we take lightly. I'd love to answer any questions that you have. Please comment down below, and I'd love to engage with you. Thank you very much, and have a great week.